Back to the show as we discuss an issue that is getting international attention. Why are there so many police shootings in the United States? First of all, thanks very much, guys, for coming back on the panel. That was an excellent first half. Let's talk about where we go from here. Mark, let's start with you. You've been a policeman. Has the law protected policemen too much in the past? How do we change the law? What can you see that can protect civilians, but also, let's face it, allow the vast majority of police officers in this country to do their job?
And I think that, you know, obviously if you have a video of a police officer doing his job and doing it correctly, you're not going to send that to anybody or post it on YouTube. So we are talking about specific instances here. You know, the part of the problem that is that if you're looking in the Fourth Amendment context, the right to be secure, that's not usually seen as an affirmative right. What we see is in the absence of unreasonable searches and seizures, we presume that type of constitutional security. And I think police officers, because of the way that they're trained, where you develop individualized suspicion, not to get too wonky, but you start with reasonable suspicion, some sort of Terry stop, and then a Terry frisk, and then you work your way, and then a dog sniff, and then at some point you get to the physical arrest. And then incident that arrest, you find more evidence. I think that stepping stone process in the fact that the subjective intent's not relevant, that's how police officers are trained, and that's basically how you develop those cases. I think if police officers, the conceptual envision was to seeing the Constitution as a super law to begin with, that you want to secure people's rights under the Constitution affirmatively, and not see it as a hindrance to your job. And like the North Charleston, I think it was for a tail light, which precipitated that whole thing. That's not what the officer was most interested in. Most likely it was to get the vehicle to stop and to go from there. And when you develop individualized suspicion, instead of working backwards from the suspicion to investigate a completed crime or keep the peace, I think that's where you get into trouble. And I think a lot of that has to do with the war on drugs and the militarization of police and the emphasis on specialty units over the patrol model.
I'm so glad you raised that point. I read somewhere that, you know, the police mentality has moved from guardians of a community to almost warriors within it. We've seen the videos of Ferguson of having sort of Iraq-style weaponry and vehicles. When did that happen?
I think it mostly, you know...
And why?
Well, basically, drugs, the drug war, that's where the federal funding came from. That's where the grants to municipalities came from. So they followed suit. If you wanted the money, you did drug enforcement and DUI enforcement. That's where you get the cops looking like the Ninja Turtles. They have all that equipment. Look, we need SWAT, but you need to call them. Every cop shouldn't look like a soldier on the street. But the one thing I'd say is that the specialty units, look, every police officer, for the most part, getting out of the police academy, wants to make detective, work on a task force, work in some sort of specialty unit. That usually, because of seniority, the way it works, leaves the least experienced officers out on the street during the most dangerous shifts, evening watch and morning watch, and they most often, as inexperienced police officers during the dangerous shifts, they're the ones most frequently to come in contact with the public. I think that specialty unit of emphasizing that instead of the patrol model and that core function of serving 911 calls and interacting with the public as uniformed officers has really shifted things, and it's to the detriment of criminal justice as a whole.
Mark Harold, thank you. John Powell, what do you think of what Mark just said, and also what would your approach be to the future of policing so we can minimise these events?
Well, I agree with much of what Mark just said. The war on drugs, which started under President Reagan, at the time, only 3% of Americans thought there was a drug problem. I actually wrote something back in the 80s saying the war on drug really is a war on black people and the black community. Part of the problem is that most of the police don't live in urban areas. You have a disproportionate number of police being white, policing black communities. The country, so we're talking about police, but we're really talking about something that's endemic in a large part of the country, where despite 50, 60 years of civil rights, the country is still largely divided by race. We don't know each other, and we view each other with suspicion, with anxiety, with distrust, at a conscious and unconscious level. And that doesn't have to end up in a shooting or killing, but if it doesn't, we need to actually train people. We actually need to bring people together. In the 90s, we talked a lot about community policing, having the community and police have a relationship. That actually leads not only to the safest policing, it also leads to the community, to the best policing, when the community is part of it. In the black community, oftentimes you have what I call over-policing and under-protection. People don't feel safe when the police are there, and the police are there to make them safe. And so if the police and the community see themselves as a team, you have a different outcome.
Atiba, we're here in Washington, D.C., and what I've noticed since living here is that there's a police force that's actually based in the community a lot of the time here in Washington, D.C. city. Whereas other places like New York, they come from New Jersey, whatever. Do you think community policing of the community by the community is a way forward here, or do we need to take a more grassroots level and change?
You know, I definitely think that community policing is the best way forward. Because there used to be a time, I remember as a child hearing, you know, the stories, the good old days, you know, the cops got to know who was in the community. And then there were certain things that happened, whether or not it was budget cuts and losing very experienced detectives and very experienced police officers who could help to train the younger forces coming through. We got away from that. And that happened here in Washington, D.C. John mentioned Ronald Reagan. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, there was an incident that occurred with a basketball player here in the United States, a very popular basketball player, Len Bias, who was drafted by the Boston Celtics, who was believed to be the savior of the Boston Celtics, that Larry Bird was going to retire. Yep. And he died because of an overdose of drugs. And then we saw the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, go on this war on drugs, and they created a disparity, a large disparity in the way that drug sentencing laws were done. And so we saw crack cocaine and cocaine a disparity there. And we started seeing, that's when we started seeing a large number of black men going to jail. We started to see this war on drugs, and we started seeing this influx of what we're seeing today.
Okay, so the war on drugs, you think, was manufactured a little bit, and we see the consequences today. Let's look forward. Video cameras on policemen. It's got a lot of play in the media and with police departments. South Carolina said they were going to do it in the wake of the water incident. Do you think it's a good idea?
Generally, yes, there's some privacy concerns, and you always have to remember that the camera can only, there's a presupposition that where the camera's looking and what you see on the camera is what the officer's looking at, and that can be a little bit different. If it's here and I'm looking over here, you're going to think I saw this. Overall, though, I think it's a good thing. I actually think it also exonerates police. Most police officers are out there doing the right thing. Those cameras are going to be evidence and show a pattern of the fact that they do their job when they're called into question without other evidence. So I think it cuts both ways. But yeah, I think they're a good idea overall.
I suppose it could also be a check unconsciously on behavior as well. John Powell, what do you think about video cameras for policemen? And also, remember, the police also have jurisdiction over this video once it's recorded sometimes, and there's some problem getting hold of it if there's been an incident.
Again, I agree that overall I think it's good. I think it's not enough. We're looking at a systemic problem, and we want to have a very specific intervention. We need to look much more upstream. We need to look at the whole overall system. And if we do that and think of cameras, experiment with them, we'll learn some things. We'll learn some things are working and not working, but it's not enough. But I think as a prophylactic, as one part of a larger intervention, we definitely should consider that.
One last question to you, Atiba. How much is America, you know, I'm a foreigner, cctv-america broadcasts all over the world. A lot of people scratch their heads and say, there's so many gun violence in the U.S., even with police officers. Is the gun culture of the U.S. partly to blame here?
I believe so. It's hard to say that it's not. When you look at what happened in Newtown, when you look at Congresswoman Giffords being shot, there's been too many instances, and there are too many instances, whether or not it's in the home with children who get hold of guns. Our gun culture is everywhere. We see it in the media, we see it on television, we see it everywhere. And when you have this gun culture, this shoot 'em up, bang bang, cowboys and Indians kind of a style, that's what we're seeing here. And it's I guess what you kind of want to say, the chicken's coming home to roost in a sense. It's like you have too many guns in too many people's hands and not enough people being responsible with those guns.
Mark, final word. Too many guns on the street makes policemen trigger happy?
I don't think exactly. I think that the long conversation. I think obviously the fact
We've got 30 seconds, sorry.
Yeah, what do you think about guns? I think the fact that the people have access to guns does have an impact on the way that individuals are policed, obviously, if you know folks are armed, but it's a much larger question. And then there's the question of, even if there are too many guns, are the remedies, the criminal remedies, really going to cut down on those or just disarm people who do act responsibly? But a much larger question.